everyone, and welcome. Whether you're joining us live or watching a recording, thank you for joining us for the King's Expert Series, The Future of Higher Education. My name is Georgina Cannon, and as Executive Director of Philanthropy and Alumni Engagement here at King's, it's a pleasure to be here to kick off this series for the academic year. Philanthropy and Alumni Engagement work to engage and partner with King's global community of alumni and supporters. We offer a range of alumni benefits, including events, whether online or on campus, in your local community, and there are also opportunities to give back to our King's community, especially to our current students. If you'd like to get in touch to learn a little bit more about this, then please, you'll see the details on the screen now. Please do get in touch. Today's webinar forms part of an award-winning King's Expert Series. This is 5 webinars a year featuring world-leading practitioners exploring King's expansive and interdisciplinary thinking on some of the most important issues of our time. During this wide-ranging conversation this evening, our experts will delve into public perceptions and the real economic value of universities, the impact of AI on graduate jobs, and the role universities must play in shaping a more resilient and inclusive society. We will then open the floor for your audience questions, and please do submit those questions via the Q&A function. Without further delay, I'm delighted to introduce our special guest chair for this evening. This King's alum has reported from the world's major conflict zones for 3 decades, making films for World in Action, Channel 4 News, and BBC Panorama. I'm very delighted to welcome award-winning journalist Jane Corbin.
Georgina, thank you, and welcome everybody to our webinar on the future of higher education. I'm going to introduce our very distinguished panel and invite them all to say a little bit about their background and why they are uniquely qualified to talk about the future of higher education. First of all, Professor Shitij Kapur, who is the Vice-Chancellor and President of King's College London.
Jane, thank you very much, and a welcome to all our alumni and guests, but a particular thanks to you, Jane, for hosting us here tonight. Now, you said, why am I uniquely qualified? Well, I'm not sure I'm uniquely qualified, but I can tell you how I might be qualified. So look, my background is as a psychiatrist and a neuroscientist, and I did that for quite a long time. But perhaps what I might bring to my role as Vice-Chancellor is an international perspective. I've had the privilege of studying in India and studying and working in Canada, in the UK, Australia, and the US. So perhaps what I could bring this panel is to an international perspective on higher education, in addition to, of course, the reality of UK higher education. So thank you, Jane.
Thanks, Shitij. And now I'm turning to Professor Dame Nancy Rothwell, who was the former President and Vice-Chancellor of the University of Manchester.
So thank you, Jane. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm a neuroscientist by training, and somehow, and I still have no idea how, I was persuaded to become President and Vice-Chancellor of the University of Manchester, a role I served on for 14 years. And during that time, I was chair of the Russell Group for 3 years. Since supposed retirement, I seem to have accumulated more jobs than I ever knew there were on various national and international bodies. So I'm not sure if I can bring unique expertise, but I will certainly try to comment. Thank you.
I'm sure you will. And thirdly, we've got Professor Dan Hunter, who is the Executive Dean of the Dixon Poon School of Law at King's College London.
Thank you, Jane. I'm the least distinguished of any of the panelists today, I have to say. So yes, I'm the Dean of the Dixon Poon School of Law. Like Shitij, I've worked in higher education across a number of countries, including Australia, America, and the UK. But that's not the main reason that I'm here, and it's not the main reason why I've got a particular position and set of experiences to be able to work with you on. It's my work doing AI and law for about the last 35 years. I was doing it long before anyone cared about it, and now, of course, everyone cares about AI. And I've been working within the college to advance the employability of our grads, to deal with AI literacy for our students, and more generally just to sort of think about how AI is going to disrupt and affect the higher education system here in the UK and elsewhere.
Thank you, Dan. And finally, we've got Professor the Baroness Wolfe of Dulwich, who is the Sir Roy Griffiths Professor of Public Sector Management at King's College London.
Thank you, Jane. And I think my primary identity remains that of a working academic at King's, where I am delighted still to be. But the reason I'm here tonight is that I was a member of the Augur Review, which has set a lot of the directions for developments in higher education for universities and beyond for the last 6 years, and in fact some of its recommendations are in the new white paper that the government has just published. And also, as you heard, a member of the House of Lords, I'm a crossbench peer, which means I'm non-party political. And I think my baptism of fire when I first joined was the passing of the Higher Education and Research Act, which also shapes a great deal about our current university environment. So I'm very happy to be here, and thank you.
I'm very happy to have you. Very happy to have all of you. So without more ado, let's move into the first area that we're going to discuss, which is very important, the public perception and the real economic value of universities. A recent study from King's Policy Institute revealed that just 31% of the UK public believe that a university degree is not worth the time and money. So that's really quite shocking, despite evidence that on the other side of the coin, 92% of recent graduates feel that it was. And I think there's an even more recent survey, Nancy was just telling me, where over 80% of students felt it was very much worthwhile. So let's talk about whether universities are worth it. And, what is it behind these attitudes? What is causing it? Shitij, would you like to give us your views on that?
So, Jane, first of all, I'm delighted to be in the company of 210 of our alumni who are all university graduates and therefore must strongly believe that university, as we know, is a good outcome. So when people ask me the simple question, are universities worth it? I really have a simple emphatic answer, and the answer is yes. Universities are worth it. But then if you ask me, why has this even become a question? It is because for the very first time, we're beginning to charge for universities. So people are paying, or undertaking debts of £50,000 to undertake a university education. So therefore the question for the very first time has started to have a denominator to it. Now, when looked at it that way, the situation does become more complex. Not every university education and not every degree at every university actually gives you you might say, a satisfactory financial return. Now, I firmly believe that should not be the only lens that we should look at university education for, because, and I'm not talking about here higher purposes like learning. No, when you look at social participation, when you look at political participation, when you look at the health of outcomes of people who go to university, when you look at the next generation of people who go to university after you've corrected for economic factors, there are huge positivities to going to university. But a debt is a debt. So I think going forward, we'll have to be clearer so that people can make the right judgment before they, of course, take on at a young age, a rather substantial debt, as to what are the returns of universities, to whom do they accrue mostly, and it'll be painful, but we have to be honest. There will be a differential across universities, and there will be a differential across courses, and people should know that as they make that choice.
Nancy, what's your view? This differentiation a real problem? I mean, what is the wider view across, not just speaking from the London point of view, but across the country on this?
So it's interesting. We did a survey of local people across Greater Manchester, and actually there was quite a positive attitude to universities, particularly in those regions where we had done a lot of work with the local communities. There was one weaker spot which we did work on, but I completely agree with Shitij that if prospective students and their parents look at a university degree solely in terms of earning power, they are missing a huge amount. A few years ago, I gave a talk on the value of a university, and I went to our head of higher education. He researches higher education, and he gave me a slide, and I can't remember everything that was on it, but on average, graduates live longer, are healthier, are less likely to divorce, are more likely to vote, are much less likely to be arrested. A whole range of things that you can't say is automatically because they went to university, because you can't do the control experiment. But there is so much more you get out of a university experience than just that earning power. And I always used to say to our graduating students, if you leave here with a bit better earning capacity, that's great. If there's nothing else, we failed you.
Alison, what do you think on this? Because obviously, at the end of the day, there is an economic factor here. You know, it's got to be worth doing, and especially from the parent's perspective, as well as the student that will potentially incur large debts by going through the process.
I think that's totally right. And the more that we are actually paying up front rather than via our taxes, the more this is something that parents and students think about. But it's also something that politicians think about a great deal. And I'm not sure that there's any way around this, but it's very easy from a politician's point of view for universities to sound very defensive. Oh, we're wonderful. Oh, we're wonderful. How could you possibly question the fact that we're wonderful? And we are, by the way, in many respects wonderful. But one of the things which I think is quite interesting is not so much that people dislike universities, so there's a fair amount of criticism. It's more about shifting attitudes to where the public wants to put extra money. And that is really quite clear that there is that if you look at how people regard top priorities in education spending, it doesn't tend anymore to be towards universities. And I think there are three reasons for this. One is the one that Shitij had already discussed, that in this country, and this, by the way, has enabled us to maintain spending, that we do have a fee regime. So that concentrates us on the spending thing. But it's also two other things. The first is that I think we are getting the backlash from the fact that for many years, politicians actually thought that universities would deliver growth. They looked at the fact that graduates are the more successful part of the population, they are earning more, they tend to be there sort of wherever you look. And they sort of convinced themselves that expanding higher education was an economic magic bullet, and that the more higher education you had, the more growth you'd have. Well, recent years have really changed that, because what we are now getting, quite inevitably, in an environment where a good half of the population is already going into higher education and getting degrees, and we have flat growth and no idea apparently how to raise it, is that we are acutely stressed fiscally, and this happy belief that higher education was so wonderful that it would solve all our economic problems has now taken a great dive, and so you get a reaction to it, an extreme reaction to it. But I think it does come back to this whole question of how we develop in the future, because for decades after the Second World War, we were all living through this amazing economic transformation of our economies. And it was that there were graduate jobs being generated across the developed world at a rate that they never had been before. And it doesn't look as if that's going to continue. And I do think there is a real challenge for universities here, that we benefited, not I think from overclaiming ourselves, but from a perception that we could do things that are actually to do with the wider economy and that are not just to do with what we do.
Dan, what about your observations on this gap between, you know, increasingly the adult population perhaps feeling, not all of them, that a university degree is a good thing, whereas perhaps it was taken for granted before, versus what students themselves feel, which is a high level of satisfaction?
Yeah, so I mean, this particular problem about social license of universities is across multiple countries, right? You see exactly the same thing in Australia, you know, where I'm from originally, and where I've worked extensively, and then in the United States, and it's interesting. I'm not, you know, I wish I had a better answer, but it's actually quite remarkable how much the political winds have changed, right? It's quite surprising. I mean, most students who are, when they're at university, love it. You know, at various levels, right? Obviously, there are sort of some outliers, and also, you know, we're not perfect. But actually, it's a wonderful experience. Most of them sort of talk fondly about it when they look back on it, and yet somehow politically, we don't have the same kind of social capital and social license that we once did, and And I don't know how much we can change that. Like there's certainly a lot of political actors who want to make it difficult for universities. They need scapegoats, and of course the nature of the time is very different from what it was 10 or 15 years ago, just politically. So my sort of take on it is, look, let's stick to our knitting. We know what we're doing in terms of delivering, value to our students. We have to manage issues around debt and those sorts of things. But at the same time, as long as we're sort of ensuring that we are relevant across the board, and it's obviously the thing that I care about in relation to AI and ensuring sort of graduate employability and all those sorts of things, making sure that they're good social citizens, then it will be as okay as it can be. I think we're academics. We spend far too much time analyzing, and not enough time just saying, look, let's just get on with it and hope for the best, and also I have to say, I'm in a situation unlike the other panelists where I have a very narrow remit. I run a faculty, that's it. Others have much larger concerns. But yeah, I think that we'll ride this out. It just may take a little time.
Dan said, we should stick to our knitting, but isn't it, if you're going to convince the government, for example, that, okay, there may have been disappointments in linking universities with growth and economic growth, but is there a way that universities can really place themselves in terms of cutting edge and research? Is this a way out? Is this a way to re-engage the public more broadly in the fact that universities do things beyond the narrow teaching remit?
Yeah, and if I could, Nancy's hand is up, so I don't know if Nancy wanted to comment on something, but
yeah, just briefly. I mean, I was just going to say, I agree with much that Dan says, but I think we can do more. I think we don't do enough to explain to the general public, the contribution that universities make. The survey that King's did is a good example. 91% of graduates felt it was worthwhile. Universities UK got an independent economic analysis that said that the university sector contributes £256 billion a year to the economy on an input of 13 billion. I don't know of any returns like that other than possibly some of the AI companies that Dan will know more about. And I think we can do more, not bragging, but just giving out some facts, and helpful if they're independently assessed facts, like the economic analysis. Thank you.
Thanks, Nancy. Shitij, what about that? Blowing your own trumpet, getting it out there, getting the message out, spreading the broader news about the good that universities and degrees do.
Yes, so I'll be very honest. I don't think whether our return of investment figures are going to cut any mustard with the general public, because they see so many of these figures that they don't care about them. I think what does cut mustard with them is the utility of the university as they feel it. This return on investment they don't see. And so when we talk about the great work that we do in partnership with health sciences, and they see it, when we talk about the great work we do with the local schools in raising the level of local schools, they see it and they feel it. And I think there is reasonable appreciation of that. Where we might have gone wrong, and this is where we need to communicate more carefully, is in the last 2 or 3 decades, we have very positively enhanced the access to university for what I would say is non-traditional backgrounds, which is people who don't usually used to go to universities, which is frankly most of us. But they had bought or had probably assumed a very simple idea. I got my kid into university, this is a panacea, they will have a high fee paying job. Whereas what they find now is they have a young man or woman coming back with the £50,000 debt, and that simple graduate job isn't there. And I think that is what is leading to a disappointment. So I think we need to honestly engage with the positive good we deliver as civic institutions, and Manchester is a great example of that, to its people. But we will also need to modify the message, because after all, if you go to university advertisement, it's become very boosterish, just like any other product that is advertised. Whereas this is a more thoughtful conversation to be had, particularly with those non-traditional families.
But it's difficult, it's difficult in a time of economic hardship not to use the economic argument, because a lot of parents will be thinking my child needs to have a good job at the end of the day because times are tough. But Nancy, you made the point very clearly, you know, it's not just about earning potential. There's just so much more going on there. So how would you spread the message, change the message, be less boosterish on the money side of things to the up and coming generations who'll be seeking to go to university?
I think she made a really good point that many universities, and certainly Manchester and King's, do a huge amount with their local communities. And I think that's why there was generally a favourable response, even in the poor parts of Bury and Oldham and so on. It was generally very positive. And when you think about the other skills that people learn, whether it's through volunteering, which many of our students do, team building exercises. I spoke to a graduate the other day who's gone into a social enterprise, is not paying back their debt, unlike some people in the chat, because they don't earn very much. But they love what they're doing and they feel it's worthwhile. And they said they could never have done that if they hadn't been at university and volunteered. So I think, you know, I completely get the fact that, as one of the questions says, we're not debt free for 20 years. That is true. But for some people, that is the lesser of their concerns. It's, am I doing something that makes a difference, that's valuable?
Alison, what would you say?
I agree with Shitij that just trying to be boosterish doesn't really help very much, because everybody's doing that. And just to sort of come back to general opinion before I talk about the positive side, I agree. People are not hostile to universities. They just don't see them as a top priority for funding in a cold climate. So I don't think we should overdo the extent to which there is antagonism as opposed to disappointment among politicians, and perhaps a sort of growing indifference in the general public. It's not what they see as top. The one area where I think that there is absolutely no question that universities are genuinely and rightly seen as terribly important is in terms of research. But of course, that's much more about the research intensive universities than it is about others. Now, obviously, this is for King's alumni. And I think it's totally true that every time there's a story about a piece of research which has direct impact on health, direct impact on people's well-being, this is really good for universities. And actually, again, talking about how public money is spent, our governments are very willing still to put a lot of money into university research. They still see it as a priority, and they see it as something that we do extraordinarily well. That's obviously less of a help if you're running a university which is struggling, where the value of the degree is quite clearly less than if you go to King's or Manchester in cold economic terms. And that comes back again to this question of how we become more integrated into communities, because again, universities are part of their communities, but perhaps less than they used to be. If you read about the civic universities in the 19th century and the extent to which they were a product of and valued by and supported by their local cities, it's remarkable. These were really civic institutions. And I do think we have rather lost that, not least because, bluntly, it doesn't pay very well, and recruiting overseas students keeps us solvent and allows us to keep internal quality high. But I think we have to really think very hard about how we become relevant to local communities on a greater scale than we are at the moment.
But are there hard choices to be made? As Shitij mentioned, we have to be clear and honest with people going forward. There will be differentials between universities. There'll be differentials between degrees. Isn't that the bottom line?
It is the bottom line, and I think we indeed have to be very clear about that. And again, actually, as Dan says, this is not just a British problem. It's clear in Australia. It's clear in the whole of North America. It's increasingly clear in France, where they are having all sorts of a nervous breakdown is hardly right, but sort of a real concern about whether or not they have wildly overexpanded their support for universities where they have very high dropout rates and no fees. So I think this is something which the whole sector is going to have to grapple with, unless, well, we'll come on to AI, unless it's a salvation as opposed to a threat, in terms of what it does to the wider economy.
Well, this is a good moment indeed to move on to the impact of AI on graduate jobs. Obviously, we want to explore Kings's strategic approach to AI in education, and maybe we should start with Dan. What approach is King's taking in this area?
So a multifaceted one, but before I sort of turn to that, it's probably worth exploring for a second, what is the likely effect of AI on employability? I mean, I think, if you read the FT or any of the newspapers these days, the assumption is that no one's going to have a job ever, right? And certainly no graduate is ever going to have a job. Having done this for a really long time and spending an enormous amount of my time these days working with professional service firms in law and in consulting and various other sorts of areas and training their people and sort of working with their senior decision makers. I think it's obvious that there is an issue that is out there. But to sort of assume that it's the end of the world for all of our graduates is it's premature, right? It's not realistic. I think what you can say is, and all of the sort of the studies show this, is sort of two things at this point, that AI is not having an actual effect upon graduate employability yet, but it might. And what actually is having the main effect upon graduate employability and the sort of the concerns that we sort of see at the moment with the current crop of grads and the next crop of grads over the next year or so, is that a lot of organizations are saying to themselves, oh, I think AI is going to take away that role, so why would I hire into that role right now? So I just not hire, but if I get it wrong, I can always hire again in 6 months' time, and that's fine for an organization, but it's really terrible for a grad who happens to be graduating right at the moment, or has graduated in the last year. And
Well,
I've
it's like
certainly
a chilling effect.
yeah, and we know from previous downturns, whether it's the pandemic or the GFC or any other sorts of areas, that there is an enormously long lag time for those graduates to make up, if they ever do, that particular lack that they had, right? Which is terrible.
Dan, before you move on to the strategy,
of course, yeah.
Perhaps I'll just go around the other members of the panel. Nancy, a chilling effect. What are we seeing? And this fear amongst graduates, really, that the future is looking a bit bleak.
Well, I'd completely agree with Dan that's probably overblown. There are organisations that are holding off. But last weekend, I was at a conference in China on AI in healthcare and in healthcare research. And the overwhelming view was AI would not replace doctors or researchers or nurses. It would just make them better. It would facilitate what they do. And that was a view that came from people who are using AI all the time, whether it's in diagnostics or in predictions or in modeling or in... But at the moment, we are in a bit of an unknown. People are not quite sure. There's no doubt routine jobs will be able to be done by AI. But the other thing that I absolutely think is that all of our graduates are going to have to be at least vaguely proficient in AI if they're going to secure those jobs. It's just going to have to be a key part of the curriculum.
Shitij.
Yes, I thought it's, this AI discussion is usually at the moment so preoccupied with hype, and often financial hype, that the data from the ground and the trenches often gets buried. So, it is producing 20% improvement in productivity all over the world, yet on the ground you can't see any of it. So here is a good piece of data, and I point this out because this tells you why universities will be very important in sorting out this for society. So Dr. Tieselink is one of our professors who's just done the most comprehensive study of the UK job market and the ads in the UK job market for the last 5 years. And 5 years is important because it allows you to compare the time before ChatGPT was even a word anyone understood and the 18 months to 2 years after that. And here is what he finds. First of all, there has been as yet no large-scale reformulation of the UK jobs, and he's looking at some 1,600 job types. Interestingly enough, there are two strong signals. One of decreasing job advertisements. Ironically, that's amongst data analysts, software coders, so all the things that you would say techie jobs. So you see, your first impulse might, oh my God, AI is coming, we should look for more techs. Somehow the world is employing less techs. What is it employing more of? Sales coordinator, sales manager, marketing at the front line. So first thing is, we really don't know how this is going to play out, but the early symbols, at least in the first 2 years of ChatGPT, don't show a wholesale change for this. And there's a similar study from Denmark shows the same thing. The other thing is, when I speak to CEOs and those people who run large companies, when I ask them, what should we as a university be doing? They use words like, oh, we need AI-enabled graduates. And I think we can all agree on that. And then I say, but what exactly, other than the fact that they have a smartphone, know how to use ChatGPT, because now 7-year-olds know how to do that. What are you really looking for? And honestly, none of them have been able to specify it other than that top level wish. So I think 5 to 10 years in time, this will have profound consequences for us. Nothing dramatic will happen in the next 6 months in the job market. And yes, there has been an increase in the number of graduate applicants for a graduate job. That is driven by AI, not by reducing the number of jobs, but the ease of making multiple applications and writing those letters. So this sudden thing we see, that the number of graduate applicants per job has actually doubled in the last 4 years. It's not because there's a huge fall in the jobs, not because it's changed in the job market. It is largely driven by the ease of application.
But that makes it even more competitive, doesn't it?
It does.
Those jobs. I mean, Alison, what do you think? I mean, Dan spoke about the chilling effect it's having now on companies, not wanting to employ those coming out of university now. And Shitij says we won't see any real effect for 5 years. Where do you think we are right now?
I completely agree with Dan that everybody is holding fire to see what's going to happen and whether anything will happen. And actually, we don't know what's going to happen. I was thinking right back to sort of, the 1990s, when there was all this stuff about we've got to teach IT skills in schools. We've got to send out IT-enabled individuals. And what these generic skills wasn't at all clear. But then over time, we all became, by default, pretty competent at using a whole wide range of different programs and different software. And my sense, and Dan may disagree, is that we're at very much that stage. It hasn't taken very long for students. It's taken, 3 days for students to learn how to use ChatGPT. That's sort of easy. Beyond that, I think we honestly don't know. I mean, the area where I've noticed, as well as coders, is actually customer service, where a lot of that is becoming very, very much, you don't get rid of it altogether, but a lot more of it becomes AI enabled. But my honest sense is that we don't know, but that for this crop of graduates, and I completely agree, it's really, really unfortunate. They're coming onto the market at a time where employers, for a wide range of reasons, including uncertainty about the world economy, are sort of holding fire. So it's like the world economy and AI are interacting. I mean, I don't know whether other people feel as Shitij mentioned, this multiple application thing. I actually think this is so horrible that probably in the end it will eat its own tail, because it is becoming, you use ChatGPT to do your application, and then it's read at the other end by a non-human, and this can go round and round and round. I don't know how we get out of it, but it seems to me semi-criminal what we're doing to kids in a sense.
I want to move on to our next series of questions, but before I do, can you just outline for me the strategy that King's is taking with regard to AI in education, fairly briefly, if you could. So we'll then move on after that.
I'll do it super briefly. So I mean, basically, we've got various programs around AI literacy, and that's not, and that's across, research, but also sort of education in various faculties and so on. I was just outlining it to my people today. So give you a really very quickly around, what we're doing, so not only will all of our students have access to the online program that I'm creating. It's a 12 class program, around, how to use AI responsibly, how to actually prompt, do all that sort of stuff. But they'll also have access to, the platforms that are actually used within practice. They'll also have access to sort of online seminars with, particular people in practice, whether they're at HSBC, at Linklater's a big law firm, or all that sort of stuff, where we're bringing in to sort of say, this is what's actually going on out there in the world. This is how it's changing. And that's just within law, and there are various other sorts of programs that I'm working with. So the idea is, in a nutshell, like the AI beast is stalking you, right? The lion is out there, but you don't have to run faster than the lion. You just have to run faster than the LSE grads is my joke, right? And, like that, there will always be jobs for relative outperformers. AI is not going to take away all these jobs, but the jobs will change, and our role is to ensure very quickly that our graduates are positioned to be able to take those jobs and to operate effectively within them.
Shitij, you wanted to come in there?
Yes, could I add what the 5-year challenge for the university?
Yep.
The 2-year challenge for the university is to make sure that our graduates who are doing their regular courses at the moment are aware and competent with the AI tools that are there, so that when they go there, they can use these tools. I think the 5 to 10-year challenge for the university is to figure out, how is our education different so that it is adding value to what will then become stabilized as what LLMs and others can do. So I cannot see that the LLMs and others, the large language models, will keep growing at the exponential pace at which they're growing. There is only so much knowledge in the world. This will finally stabilize. And then the real question is, what can the university add in those 3 years? Because a high school student will be able to generate the first level answer. And I think that's the really interesting possibility for us. And I don't have the answer.
That leads us probably into our last section here, which is to explore the role that universities must play now in shaping a more resilient and a more inclusive society with AI, obviously. The UK has one of the finest university systems in the world, providing one of the best graduation success rates globally. Nearly 80% of those who start university complete their course. But what would help ensure that UK universities serve the future of the nation and our students? Nancy, what do you think?
So there are a number of facets, a number of potential answers to that question, but I'm going to pick out 2 in particular. One is the social contribution, which I think is incredibly important. And actually what we haven't talked about in AI, which is really important, is public trust, governance. These are all really, really important things. And by the way, interesting, Shitij, I was at a different panel for MRC, and somebody very senior from Google said, I can see it leveling out. I think the next 5 years we'll see a leveling out. So just as an aside, so I think that the social contribution of our graduates to, whether it's through the work that they do or the other activities that they do. And then the other one is the economic contribution. I'm Deputy Chair of the Industrial Strategy Council. We just published the Industrial Strategy. And I think most universities now are looking at, how do we drive innovation? How do we absolutely do not give up discovery research, but how do we try to ensure that that is better brought to application, to commercialization, to social benefit, to economic benefit? And I think those 2 are really critical at the moment, and they're what the government expects of us.
Thank you. Alison, what does the research say on the role of universities in modern societies?
I'm not sure that it says very much, curiously enough, and that comes back to the things that have changed, because a lot of the research is about the economic returns to the graduate and how on earth you actually figure out how much that is personal, how much of that is social. And that definitely is, one of these rabbit holes that one can go down a very long way. But I would like to say that I think one of the big challenges for universities in terms of really contributing to a good, cohesive society is to be involved with a much wider age range of the population. And one of the things that has happened, again, not by any means just in this country, is that curiously enough, as higher education has become more and more common, it's actually also become more and more youthful. And we don't have anything like as much contact with older adults as, curiously enough, we used to. At the end of the First World War, one of the things that all universities signed up to was creating adult education departments, almost all of which have now closed. Now, I don't think that reinventing the old style adult education department is the answer, but it highlights, because that was a move to make universities contribute to the healing of society after a terrible world war. And I do think that one of the things that not intentionally but relentlessly has happened is that we have become more and more about the early years, the transitioning from school to first job in the labour market, getting a master's degree to put yourself a bit further ahead. A real challenge for us in a society which itself is aging and where technical change is also likely to go on is how we engage better with a much wider range of people in terms of age and not just family background at the age of 18.
Yeah.
I think we can, but I think it's not something that we currently do very well.
Yeah, and that obviously would help the public's perception of the utility of degrees and what it gives society as well, if you spread the experience more widely, if you like. Dan, of course, though, we all know that universities are hubs for research and innovation, so that must be critical for a future role for higher education.
Yeah, so I think it's interesting. We're starting to see, certainly at King's and at other institutions, a move from the idea of having, a vice president, vice principal for research, and now vice president for research and innovation, right? And so this idea of translation of research has become much more important. That's true in most universities, certainly true at King's. You certainly see that a great deal. And I think one of the things that's most attractive about King's is its ability to translate research across a wide range of disciplines, and I think we're really seeing that. So Seb Ursulan has been appointed as an assistant principal for this particular sort of topic. I think we at King's have a little way to go. Other institutions are sort of a little bit more, further advanced. But certainly it's part of the industrial strategy or industrial policy of the government. It's typically industrial policy of every government. And universities play an unbelievably vital role in that sort of infrastructure, in that ecology.
Shitij, what steps do you believe, and what steps indeed is King's taking to ensure that King's and more widely UK universities serve, the future of the nation and students too?
Yes, I think Dan's rightly positioned where King's is at the moment. I probably want to introduce a note of caution in all of this. Economic prosperity is not generated by universities. Universities are probably an important link in the chain of events that must come together for economic prosperity. And let me give you an interesting example. The most spectacular increase in economic prosperity in the last 30 years has been in Singapore and Korea. They got their prosperity before they got their great universities. Their great universities are a consequence of their prosperity, not the initial cause of it. Of course, now they are very relevant. So I think I want to be careful in the government not seeing us as the handmaiden in the pursuit of economic prosperity. Don't get me wrong, I'm not taking away from my responsibility, but I don't want to promise something we cannot do. What we can do is provide the learned scholarly individuals who participate and contribute to creating economic growth and productivity. Well, who knows the answer to that? And there is a certain other wolf who writes very clearly about this, and you can read. In fact, there is a very interesting paper most recently that Martin Wolf in the Financial Times has brought to people's attention, is that our productivity has stalled, and it has stalled all over the world. And ironically, something called the total factor productivity, which arises from innovation, has stalled the most and even gone negative in this era of AI and internet and what have you. So look, I don't know the answer to that. I think what we universities can do is absolutely remain alive to this responsibility, but our answer to that is through learning and talent rather than through the economy itself.
Thanks, Shitij. I want to just move on now and take some questions from all of you out there to put to the panel. And, maybe following on from what you said, I think this is an interesting question, which is, what are your views on degree inflation? More undergraduate degrees that aren't relevant to the majority of jobs. Nancy, that's a tough one, isn't it? But what do you think?
I think there is a concern at the moment. We have a government. I put this to a group of vice chancellors at a dinner just this week. But we have a government that has pretty much said we have too many universities. It's not something that necessarily everybody would agree with, and it's a path down which it's a really difficult one. But there is no doubt, as Shitij was very clear about at the beginning, that there are not only different universities but different degrees in terms of preparing people for the workforce. An amazing institution that is right next door to the University of Manchester is the Royal Northern College of Music. It's a fantastic institution, and many of their graduates get jobs, but they are incredibly low paid because they're musicians, but they love it. That's what they want to do. Now, that, I think, is an incredibly valuable contribution to society. I am more concerned about the number of universities doing degrees in business studies, or perhaps Dan might want to comment even in law, where realistically that's not going to prepare them for the workforce. And I sense also, and it came out in the white paper actually, a view from government that research is too thinly spread, too underfunded, and that it will have to be more concentrated, and we will have to sacrifice volume in order to get better funding, because the sector is subsidizing most of the research we do. So I think that there is a concern about proliferation and about the range of outcomes. There are some providers with completion rates that are far too low. I think it's almost criminal that some students go in to certain courses in certain universities and only 50% of them will even graduate having paid all that money. That surely cannot be acceptable.
Yeah. And here's a question on finance and debt, probably neatly tied to that. Higher education, they say, is also the key to breaking generational poverty. So do you think that this benefit alone outweighs the debt? I mean, Alison, maybe you'd like to take that because you're hot on the economics of this. What would you say to that question?
Yes, well, I think unfortunately higher education isn't the answer to breaking intergenerational poverty entirely, because for all the reasons that we've gone into, I mean, getting a good degree in a university which provides really intensive tuition is pretty expensive. And I don't think the answer to intergenerational poverty is to send everybody to university. I mean, I mean, it would be lovely to do that, but I'm kind of with the population as a whole. I'm not sure it's my number one priority. So I think that, again, one of the things we have to tackle to some extent is whether we are creating incentives for people to take degrees, which they may get a lot out of personally, but which they feel that they're carrying this debt, and the marginal rate is quite high, as I'm sure some of the people on this are very, very aware of themselves. Is this something that we should be really creating a strong incentive for people to do?
Shitij?
Sorry, what is true, of course, is that there are a lot of jobs out there for which you need skills which we are very, very good at teaching. And what I think we probably do have to do is to rebalance to some extent and introduce a bit of more central planning than we've had in the past, because as institutions, we're not allowed to talk to each other because we're for fear of being held up by the competition authority for conspiring against the public interest. But I do think, and we did say this actually in the Augur Review, that you probably need to have a bit more central planning of what is available than we have had in the last decade or two.
Do you want to pick up briefly?
Yeah.
I'd like to move on to the next question.
Yes, what I would like to float is the idea that what we will need to break is the stranglehold of the 3-year degree on the post-secondary imagination. Because think of it, how arbitrary it is that either you studied a high school, or for all intents and purposes, your only really good other option for which the state will give you money is a 50,000 option. That takes 3 years. There is nothing about human brain development that says that after high school you must add 3 years really to get to the next point. One could easily conceive in another world, and in a future world I think it'll be true, a more graduated system where people can choose, test, and adapt to their realities rather than fit themselves into a 3-year degree system, apparently, invented in Bologna 700 years ago. So I think this is something that is up for question. It's that the 3-year degree as the main dominant and practically only other reasonable option will probably have to give way.
I'll carry on with a general question here on public perception. But before that, somebody's just asking Dan about AI. Is the use of AI in higher education reducing students' ability to research and analyze? How is it affecting universities' ability to examine students' work as well?
Great question. So I mean, this is one of the 3 or 4 nightmarish questions that we in higher education have to grapple with AI. So it's the first problem, which is how do we deal with assessment? How do we deal with creativity? How do we deal with the fact that up till now we knew that if someone produced something and we looked at it very cursorily, that in fact that was a good proxy for them understanding the material or thinking about the material. And now, of course, it's not, because large language models can do so much of what we do, and so we have to completely rethink, our approach around this sort of thing. I mean, like a very simple example. In a PhD, you would spend the first year of your PhD looking at every single article, every single piece of work around that, and then you would write your chapter, which was a synthetic review of all of those areas, and say that now I understand this, right? Your job was to say, okay, I understand the field, and now I'm going to contribute to the field, right? But that first year now takes 17 minutes with OpenAI, right? Like it's just like it's done, right? So we have to rethink what that first year of a PhD looks like. We have to rethink the idea of what an essay in a law school looks like. It used to be that we would give them a problem and they would write it, and that was a dissertation or it was an answer to an exam question. And it was very efficient for us to mark that paper, right? Because the only way you could produce that paper is if you understood the material. And now, of course, OpenAI GPT understands the answer, but you don't, because you haven't given any thought to it. And so that's the crisis. That's the first crisis. There are many other crises in higher education as a result of AI, but that's the first crisis that we have to deal with. We have not handled that well, I have to say. We will work it out. We haven't managed to work it out yet. I think one of the things that is really interesting as an AI researcher, who happens to be the dean in charge of 120 people, academics, is trying to get them to recognize the nature of the problem rather than saying we're going to ban AI. I'm like, well, under some conditions we need to, of course. But for a lot of it, we can't. Like, it just doesn't make any sense. There's no way that you can rely upon the honor code or that for them to say, I haven't used AI. They clearly have. So we have to change everything. And of course, Shitij uses this line a lot from The Leopard by Lampedusa. In order for everything must change in order for things to remain the same. And so we have to completely rethink the way in which we do things as a consequence of this change.
And
it's
quite swiftly as well.
and it's moving so fast. Like,
it's not going to wait for you.
It's not. It's really not. And like the funny thing is, like I would have said a year ago, oh, okay, I think we're okay. I think it's not, the technology is not going to improve that much. This was, I think, an observation that Shitij made before. Unfortunately, although there's no more data, the technologists are getting better at this. The AI researchers are getting better. And so, in fact, the current generation of large language models are now so good that effectively, I'm perfectly happy to put my hand up and say they are better than me at my area, right? Like, and that's really challenging. And of course, for an academic environment, it's impossible. It's just impossible.
Here's a question on public perception. Are modern universities becoming less relevant because they're failing to represent and respond to the population, i.e. woke? If part of a population feels disenfranchised from educational discourse, they likely won't want to engage. Is this more of an opportunity than a setback? Universities obviously need to reconsider their place in society. Nancy, how would you answer that?
So I think we are reconsidering our place in society. I think, we do recognise that is changing, and we will need to adapt. AI is not the only factor that makes us need to adapt. I see quite a number of questions on financial situation in universities that we may or may not have time to come on to. And we're having to recognise that universities have been around for 1,000 years, but actually they're probably changing more in the last 5 years than they have in the last 500. And I should just point about the 3-year degree. We're going to have to offer different forms of reskilling, of upskilling throughout life. Point that Alison made. And I think that's quite hard for universities, because having been a university vice-chancellor for 14 years, they're pretty big ships to turn, actually. It's not easy to change things in universities. And again, at the conference on AI, one of the expert panelists, a physician who also has a degree in AI, said, what's the biggest challenge? And he said, it's changing our academics. That's the biggest challenge we face. So I think, we are changing and adapting, but I think it's not easy.
Shitij, this perhaps could be directed at you. It follows on from what you were saying about changing the lengths of degrees, the way they're done, etc. And this questioner says, one challenge lies with the introduction and propagation of apprenticeship programs. Are universities pushing for this, thereby devaluing themselves?
I don't think universities are pushing for it, but honestly, I do welcome that, because I want the person leaving high school to have options. People learn in different ways. Science tells us that people learn in different ways. Some learn by reading, some learn by doing. And in many ways, apprenticeship is a way that facilitates learning by doing in the context of doing, and adds to it the sort of cognitive component. Universities go about it the other way around. We add more the cognitive component and then some experimental, and then you learn when you go out. So I think it is good that we don't set an arbitrary number of how many people should go down the cognitive route first, because let me say something that I do not wish to be understood but is mathematically true. 50% of the population by design has an IQ lower than 100. That's what the number means. So pushing everyone down a cognitive route, when that is not the only route to success, and it's not the only measure of human goodness, people break. So I am encouraging of it. Now then the question is, what is the role of universities in apprenticeships? Now that then becomes more complex. Degree apprenticeships, well, universities do degrees and they might find themselves easier to move into degree apprenticeships. But then apprenticeships come with just 1 year of level 4 or 2 years of level 4 and 5. I think if universities start doing all of that, they will find it very hard as institutions. So it's a good point for differentiation. Others should be encouraged to do it.
Alison.
Yes, I completely agree with what Shitij just said, and it's just to sort of put this in context. I said at the beginning that basically the population as a whole doesn't see universities as its top spending priority. There's huge support for apprenticeship, and with very good reason, because for a lot of occupations and for a lot of young people, this is actually a very good way to learn. We have, in many ways, messed up our apprenticeship system at the moment in this country. There are at least 4 people chasing every opportunity, even quite a low one. And that's, I think, a major priority, which to some extent the government recognises. But I do also think this issue of whether or not degree apprenticeships are the future. I'm complete with Shitij on this. I think trying to shoehorn everything into university delivery on the grounds that that gives it kudos is first of all, it doesn't particularly. And secondly, it asks universities to do something which they're not actually set up to do very well. So I think that for many politicians, there was actually the delusion that the only way you would make apprenticeships successful and highly regarded was by having degree apprenticeships. I think most universities that have delivered them have found that it's actually quite a challenge. It doesn't fit easily. It's really very hard work because it doesn't fit with the way that apprentices are working. They're scattered around. You can't get groups that are big enough to actually make sense. And generally, I think it makes much more sense to think clearly about the best way to deliver the training element of an apprenticeship. But I would say that universities are not in any sense sort of devaluing themselves by doing apprenticeships. It's just that actually these are different things.
We're drawing towards the closing phase of the webinar. So I'd just like to, there's a good question here, which I think we could just run around all of you and see what your response is to sort of in fairly short order to wrap it all up. And this questioner says, we read and hear constantly of the financial crisis facing the UK higher education sector and the growing number of universities in deficit or even potentially facing insolvency. How does the panel see this crisis being resolved? Nancy, perhaps we could start with you.
Yeah, it is a problem, and it's not just a problem for universities that are on the verge of insolvency, which thankfully are very few. It's a problem for the sector, because even universities that are doing well, as I'm sure King's is, we just don't have the funding that we used to have to be able to invest in our students, invest in future education, invest in research. And some people may not be aware of this, we get the dreaded levy on international fees, that will take tens and tens of millions out. So we can't just throw our hands up in horror and say what we're going to do about it. Of course, there are a lot of solutions. There are shared facilities, there are potential mergers, there are federations, etc., all with their own issues, I have to say. I do think that automation will be one solution, and I do think we will need some more rationalization of the educational courses we provide. If I can give the example, modern foreign languages. Every university is struggling to recruit to modern foreign languages, but we don't want to lose them. So we will have to be delivering things like that through consortia, where you do French, you do Italian, you do Japanese, you do Chinese. And I've argued with the government main funder of research, UKRI, that we will have to have more research consortia, bringing together complementary strengths across different universities to address big problems.
Dan, financial crisis, I realise this may be slightly up the scale, but
no.
Financial crisis. How is the crisis to be resolved?
I still worry about that. I mean, I think that there's enough money in the system for us to actually be able to resolve this crisis, hopefully without too many bankruptcies amongst universities. But I mean, I think we're now entering a period of cost containment, right? Where we've recognized that there are some problems, and that in fact the spigot of money, which used to be the international student funding, for many institutions is being cut off. All right, and so that's just a useful financial kind of corrective. It's the normal kind of thing that happens. Hopefully, we will not have too many changes too quickly, so that institutions can adjust. But there's lots of money in the system, and so that's just the nature of the dismal science of economics, and especially finance, that institutions will adjust. It will be painful, but they will adjust.
Alison.
Yeah, I agree with Dan. I think for some institutions it's going to be very tough, but I think we should also be aware that our funding per student looks pretty nice if you are in most other countries. It could be a whole lot worse. And I think we are also aware that this level of funding is absolutely at the heart of the fact that we do still have a really, really good system, which is why some of us are still able to recruit very large numbers of people, both domestically and overseas. But I do think, and this goes back to the sort of the point about the system as a whole, that it's going to be very painful in some areas. And I do actually think that the government is going to have to do a bit more strategic planning than it's willing to do at the moment. I don't think large numbers of institutions are suddenly going to close, leaving cold spots and deserts. I mean, in the end, it's very hard for a government to stand by and see a university completely shuttered that is the key institution in an area which might have been once a collection of safe seats, but just generally because there is an obligation to the population. But I don't feel as though they are really thinking enough about what it might be like 5 or 10 years down the road in terms of if continued trends go, King's, for example, goes on getting bigger and bigger, Manchester goes on getting bigger and bigger, where is this going to end? I think the government has got to do a bit more strategic and central planning than it has been inclined to do up to now.
So, Shitij, the financial crisis facing universities, how do you see it being resolved?
So the first thing I should say, since I have 200 of my respected alumni here, that King's is in a difficult sector in a good place. But I think your question was about the sector. My overall diagnosis of our sector is, given that our country isn't swimming in money, I think our sector will find it hard to get more public finance, at least for the next 3 to 5 years. So I think for the next 3 to 5 years, we will have to see it more as a problem of allocation rather than a problem of quantity. Now, to me, what is missing at the moment is that the general idea is that the market will lead to efficient allocation. Right. A university is just not that kind of a good, that the market economics will allocate efficiently. Now, this will require a shift in thinking. This will require something that vice-chancellors never really want, is central interference. But you could call that strategic planning. So I think, but I don't think we have a choice. And when I mean inefficient allocation, it is, Nancy gave one example, but it is also where we choose to do research and how many institutions we do it and how we use teaching to cross-subsidize research. So so my plea would be, it would be great if we could have more money, but we'll only have that if the nation gets richer. So we have to find better ways of allocating, and it might require guidance from above.
Well, thank you all very much. And thank you to the great questions that we've had from the 200 alumni out there. We've really given us a really good spread across the discussion we've been having today. It's been absolutely fascinating. Thank you all very much. And over to you, Georgina.
Well, thank you, Jane. And let me say a huge thank you to you for being such an excellent chair and for powering through those questions so efficiently. And yes, also thank you to our panel of experts and to our alumni for those really thoughtful and interesting questions. I hope you enjoyed it. I certainly did. And I learned a lot as well. A special also thanks to the panel, especially Dan Hunter. So a special shout out to him for answering so many questions live during the event by filling in answers to the Q&A. So thank you for that. We always really appreciate your feedback and try to make these events as good as possible. So please, if you can have spare us a moment, please complete our quick event survey. You can do this via the QR code on the screen. And I hope you will also look out for our next webinar, which is on the 25th of November. And that's going to be around climate law and sustainable business for public good. Thank you, everyone, and look forward to seeing you next time.